So, Democrats talk about saving our democracy, while Republicans say that we're not a democracy, but we're a republic. Which is it? We'll find that out in our first episode of The Echo Chamber. For a future beyond today's narratives, welcome to The Echo Chamber. This podcast is going to be focusing on looking at all sides on social and political issues and trying to apply critical thinking skills so that we can all have greater empathy for other perspectives while having better discernment for ourselves where the truth might lie and where deception might lie in the narratives that we hear. And joining us today is my good friend, Chris Miller, who has been a good sharpening stone for me because he thinks differently than I do, socially and politically, but we both have enough respect for another and one another's perspectives that it generates good conversations that help kind of stretch, at least on my side, stretch my perspective on a lot of things and challenge a lot of my assumptions. And so, Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, both of us, I think, should give a little bit of perspective on where we're coming from. If you were to describe to just the average person what your social and political background and perspective is, how would you describe that?
I started out in a farm town where there was a bunch of conservatives, but I was part of a liberal family, more democratic. So, I mean, I don't know if you really consider it liberal or not. But then I kind of stayed more on the democratic liberal side for quite a while. Then went through a little bit of emotional trauma a little bit later in my life, late high school, early college-ish time. And for a little bit there, I kind of red-pilled myself for a minute. And then I started to realize that I care more about people than what most of the red pill stuff indicates. So I started leading more and more progressive. And I kind of settled somewhere center left. I would say I joke that I am an anarcho-communist just because it pisses everybody off. But really, my entire goal in political thinking is to just try to get people to have better formulated arguments so they're just not regurgitating memes all the time.
Yeah, makes sense. That fits in perfect what we're trying to do here. So, my name's Preston, Preston Maloney, and I would say that I was raised conservative, and I tend, as I have developed, I've leaned more libertarian. Loved the Ron Paul revolution movement; was a big part of what formed my social and political views. And since I have been growing in that perspective and coming to understand that there are issues on all sides, libertarian, conservative, Democrat, liberal, doesn't matter, and that we need the perspective of all sides to keep us in balance and keep us on course. And so that's part of what I'm going to be discovering on this podcast is reaching out to people who have vastly different perspectives and challenging my own perspective. And you can join me on that journey. And hopefully together we can kind of challenge our preconceptions and get a wider view of how the world really works and what's really compatible with human nature and government structures to have the best for humanity. So today we're going to answer the question of are we a republic or a democracy, or at least discuss around the topic. So we're going to go over some general concepts of different forms of government that are out there and kind of try to understand what they are. So first, there's autocracy. Now, when I looked into this, I found that dictatorships and monarchy were the two forms of government that clearly fell under this category for me. And so it's a form of government that's led by an individual, and usually no other government form of authority. There can be forms of government under that authority, but ultimate authority rests on an individual. So, Chris, do you have anything to add to that one or any interesting points?
I was going to add something, but you clarified. that like under a king or a monarch or whatever top tier person, whatever you want to call it, a czar or yada yada. Uh, there's always a bunch of other power players underneath it, but when it
Yeah.
comes down to it, uh, the autocrat is usually the one that a majority of the population follows. And so when that happens, that's when it really falls under the autocracy. There's no real checks and balances for the top other
Yeah.
than hard power.
Have you ever seen any kind of autocracy work effectively? Now, when I say effectively, I mean for the common good.
No, but effectively, yes.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, say I mean, it was the name of the game for most of like our. I mean, I wouldn't call it our modern society, but once we started getting into larger than city states, uh, tended to be where a lot of at least the European style governance happened. Seems like Japan and quite a few other places as well fell under that general category. Except you can argue some of them were more theocracy or not, but as a
Yeah.
general rule, yes, I'd say it was probably one of the most dominant uh, political structures that have happened so far.
And that moves us on to oligarchy, which kind of goes hand in hand with autocracy, in my opinion, because, like we were saying, there has to be a social and political and power structure underneath a leader. But in an autocracy, the authority is more centralized in a group rather than an individual. So this includes plutocracy or plutocrats, ruled by the wealthy, autocracy, which is ruled by nobility, kleptocracy, which is ruled by corrupt officials. And I also included theology here because even though in some theologies you can have an individual, it seems like it's more of a structure of people or a church or a religion that's kind of in charge, although the line can kind of blur there. And I also included feudalism because in my impression of feudalism, it was monarchy in that the king had absolute authority, but it would kind of shift it a little bit towards an oligarchy where you had a structure of lords with degrees of authority. But that more clearly fits under autocracy. But yeah,
As a general understanding for me, and I could be a little bit off base on this, when you come down to oligarchy, an oligarchy can be present in an autocracy or in a democracy or in any other hierarchical thing. And they aren't necessarily ever saying, hey, we're in power. But if they hold the means to control major levers of either power or the economy more so than the actual government, then that's where I would usually say it's an oligarchy, or at least at a similar, if not more, like a stronger value or leverage than uh, the autocrat. Um,
okay,
yeah, say so. It could be, say, a democratic oligarchy where there's a president, but the president is really just a figurehead, and there's a whole bunch of rich people that are controlling the narratives and the vote, or the mindset that people use to vote in the democratic, the elected people, or it could be something like Russia, where they're still technically democratic, but it is very clearly slightly more top down, where uh, instead of leveraging the power of the government and the democratic will, they use uh, leverage of allowing governmental uh, like grants and land usage to get certain people that are loyal to the Kremlin to have massive amounts of like purchasing power, ability to leverage things against everybody else that's in their fields. So it essentially is like monopolistic,
okay,
and they kind of silo power into the oligarchs in the more top down version. However, the more bottom up version would be more certain technological or energy based or like really powerful industries tend to rise up, and then all of a sudden, without regulation, they have the ability to, say, starve the masses or take over large swaths of like the influence market, to then have control over what most of the narrative or most of the powers levers are.
Yeah.
So there's
Russia
it kind of goes both ways.
Yeah, Russia's an interesting example. So my impression, you can tell me how far off you think I am on this, but my impression of Russia is it has a democratic republic kind of facade, but it's really more of an autocracy oligarchy structure and how the power actually works.
It depends on if you live in Russia or not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say that fits my understanding fairly well. I would say that that's more like the facade of democracy with the siloed powers that the quote unquote autocrat, uh, or Putin, if we just want to be blunt, uh,
Yep.
is in control of either through threats of death or the ability to remove their ability to run their own businesses on their own land.
Yep.
So yeah, so it's a oligarchy. So he picks and chooses the winners, but he doesn't necessarily pick and choose the markets, or
Yeah.
the laws. But the laws don't really seem to affect him.
And my impression has been that much of the leadership in Russia also has a lot of the wealth and business ownership. And so that's a pretty good sign that there's an oligarchy and works there.
Arguably less of a percentage than in the U.S.
Yeah. And that's another good conversation point. How to what degree do you think the United States leans towards an oligarchy?
More and more every day.
Yeah.
I'd say there were better, more active measures to avoid it in the past. I think Citizens United, where it essentially made it so money was more valuable than votes, definitely uh, started to lean us more and more oligarchic. And
Mhm.
as we have not had any real checks on monopolistic powers in the last like 40 years, I
Yeah.
think that has also led us to become much more monopolist or much more oligarchic. I mean, I think we went through stretches in the past, in the U.S. where it was a little oligarchy esque, but I think we're the closest to it now than we've ever been.
Yeah, I would agree with that. In fact, that's a topic I'd love to get into on a future podcast because, yeah, money in politics, it corrupts everything that we've tried to build. So let's move on to communism. And Chris, I'm going to actually have you take the lead on this one since you have done a lot more reading and a lot more thinking within this realm. What are your thoughts on what communism is? What is it defined as?
So, not to be hyperbolic, but it also just depends on who you are as to what communism means in this scenario. Because some people just assume that communism is autocratic, hierarchical, because, I mean, to just lay this out there so I don't feel like I need to hide it the whole time. It There's never been a real communist country, just like there's never been a real capitalist country. And we've turned the idea of communism into a hard boogeyman because any potential attempt to apply a communistic structure has been hijacked
Mm,
by an autocratic group, or some group seeking power. If we were talking specifically about theoretical communism, it would be a classless stateless society where there is no particular hierarchy in any real structure. But that doesn't necessarily mean that people can't get a little bit more rich or a little bit less rich than others. But there's a more community driven design plan. So if you want to say a more central government or central control, but that could be autocratic in practice. That seems to be where it goes, or it in the more idealistic form would be a more true democracy, where all of the laws were voted on by everyone, and everyone communally made the decision as to what people were going to be making and what markets were open and how much competition there was in what areas. Uh, so yeah, so it's not incredibly well laid out what a true communistic society really would be. It was all kind of like vaguely alluded to under Marx and Engel.
Okay. So, out of the examples that we've seen in history, have there been any example of it functioning to any degree for even a short period of time? Because, yeah, as you mentioned, some form of power structure has always corrupted every attempt at a communist type of structure.
So the ones that most people reference as there was a I don't have I didn't make notes for this, so I'm kind of off the cuff in this. But there was a French colony that was formed in like I don't know if it's like 1760, 1700s. Uh, that or no, it would have been a little bit later than that. 1760s maybe? I don't know, not important. But they had a pretty communistic society uh, that was running for like a year or two. Uh,
Okay.
and then the French government came in and obliterated them. Uh, it was not, it was a pretty violent, not so great thing for the people involved.
Yep.
Then the next one would have been the most commonly referred to one is probably the Soviet Union era Lenin times, before Stalin came in and became like the turbo autocrat that he became, where it totally ripped away any semblance of power to the people in a classless, stateless society, and it just became all central planning all the time. And so it was just Stalin and his little group just knew everything the best. Uh, and there've been a few like little upstarts, like Venezuela is kind of socialistic, but not communist, like not full blown classless, stateless. But pretty much everywhere that communism starts to develop, either someone comes in and just destroys the system, or someone comes in and hijacks the system. That may be an inherent flaw of the overall system as itself, because one of the jokes that I make is both communism and capitalism are perfect on paper, but it is very clear that we are far too selfish to have communism really evolve anywhere, and we are also far too selfish to really allow capitalism to come anywhere.
Yep.
So it's a yeah, I'll say both of them in theory are really good, but humans are not so good.
Yep. That's been my thought about capitalism in general, is it's compatible with the worst and the best of humanity when it's managed properly. Whereas communism, the only way that I could see it actually functioning at some future attempt is if you had something like an AI, something that was theoretically incorruptible, that was helping to manage all of that. But that's a theory.
I would
So
say the
with,
same with capitalism.
yeah, maybe. Uh, with communism, do you have ownership of anything, of land, of resources, or is it all communally owned?
I It would be more communally owned by the inherent nature of the theory of communism, but again, if you are allowed to have, say, capitalism that is managed somewhat differently than
Hmm.
just pure capitalism, open market stuff, then in theory, you could have certain amounts of ownership that would be able to be applied. Like personal property would, in theory, be allowed under communism, but under most circumstances, I'm assuming that they would probably implement like 100% death tax. So it's like once you're dead, you don't own your stuff; it doesn't pass down to your family. But also, in a lot of those scenarios, it wouldn't necessarily need to, because by the time your family was there, the community would, in theory, be providing the stuff that was needed to help them flourish.
So this might be an unfair question since we haven't really seen a sustainable version of communism yet, but how would you how would you think communism could work as far as accountability of any form of leadership and enforcement when it comes to any kind of structure and laws?
Uh, it would. I mean, in a perfect world, you wouldn't need to, but uh, there. I mean, it would be pretty much like any other governmental system. You would have to have some people that are enforcement people, some people that are judicial type people that decide things, and then there would have to be defined laws that everybody like followed.
Hmm.
It's not too out of character to any other type of governmental system. It's just where the final say lies. So it'd probably be a little bit less. Yeah, it'd probably be a little bit less a judge is ever going to make the final decision. It's probably always going to be like a jury of your peers. I don't know if that would actually like because that could be in a more anarcho style system where there's less government. It could literally just be uh, everybody in the society has a rotation of time that they're part of the jury system and they have to go help
Hmm.
make the decisions. But it could also be that you could have uh, it set as a job type. So one of the groups of people could literally be their jobs could be juries.
Yeah.
Uh, and so
But the
they would be
que-
spending most of their time just figuring out, knowing the laws, and then making decisions based on the laws as to if all the evidence that was provided in those situations were justifiably good enough or bad enough to either throw them in jail, excommunicate them, or whatever system of punishment that that society chose to do.
yeah. My question would be how you would fight corruption in that kind of a system. Just because if you're having any form of judge or leadership or making laws, you're always going to have people who naturally are more inclined to seek after power and authority, just by personality. And so, how would you protect a system from people like that who would like to gain more and more authority and centralize more and more authority for the purpose of safety, for the purpose of prosperity, whatever the case might be?
In theory, communism would be the most democratic system out there. So it would be the will of the people. One
Gotcha.
person, if they started to get out of hand, the will of the people would just be like, "You're out."
Yep. Yep. So
You
would
by killing or excommunicating or throwing in jail forever. Yeah, so I mean, I yeah, say it would be defined by the laws of the commune, if you will.
yep. Gotcha.
But yeah, it would
Let's.
be more democratic. I mean, again, unless it's take like in the more practical sense, it's just autocracy. So it's like, well, don't like you, fuck off.
So would
Uh,
it be a majority rules form of democracy?
I think. I mean, I in theory, yes, I would assume.
Hmm.
Um, but again, that's kind of the hiccup of communism, which is you have to have like good people, uh, and you have to have people kind of on a similar page for it to all function well. Uh, any system can be hijacked.
Yes, for
So
sure.
and so the more decentralized the system, you have a better chance of it not being hijacked all at once.
Yep.
But the more decentralized the system, the more you can individually hijack small parts of it
Yep.
and then use those small parts to leverage against other parts.
Makes
So
sense.
you always have to audit, you always have to have people that are trying to find people that are uh, like coming in and messing things up. And you always have to have some kind of law and order in any real structured society. So it's
Yep.
like communism doesn't really have any major differences on that sense, other than like what type of hierarchical power structure you're in. If it's more democratized, then it's a bunch of people making that decision, and then if it's more hierarchical, it's the autocrat who took over,
Gotcha.
or the group of people that are taking over,
Yep.
that would be able to probably influence enough of it. But just like capitalism or democracy, I mean, capitalism isn't so much a political structure more than just a economic structure.
Hmm.
But which that could arguably be the case for communism as well. But it just depends on what definitions people are using for it or
Yep.
what way they're trying to argue it right then.
Yep. So let's move on to socialism. what is socialism and how is it different than communism? Because I hear a lot of confusion there. Communism, socialism are kind of talked about interchangeably.
So I think that the confusion is intentional, uh, and that's because of some holdover from the Cold War, where America found that the biggest enemy in the world is the Soviet Union and the later Russia, which were quote unquote socialist. And that's the whole Red Scare, McCarthyism, all of that stuff, where we were just turning on our own people and just saying everybody was socialist for the sake of saying they were socialist. But what socialism technically is that uh, the people and or groups that work in a means of production, so like in unions or in a corporation, if we want to put like that term, is that they would have uh, some of the fruit or a somewhat equal percentage of the fruit of all of the labor. And so, whereas in capital, we have a tendency, or in a capitalistic society, we tend to hold a higher value in the ownership of something. And in a more socialistic structure of the economy, it would be the labor or the people or the social groups have more of a uh, have more control over the means of production and what is being produced and how that is being distributed. So it's like socialism itself, again, isn't a particularly uh, all encompassing political structure. It's more of a means by which uh, the people have control of the means of production. And so, how that translates, like in that, the theoretical, uh,
Mhm.
how that seems to translate into the real world is that something like it seems to pretty much only structure itself into more of like a social democracy or a socialistic democracy, but all of them seem to have pretty strong elements of capitalism in them.
Mhm.
But sometimes, like a CEO is not, or a CEO owner is never going to have the same overarching means of collecting all of the profits in a more socialistic environment, because this uh, one of the more socialistic type groups that we would have in our society that is a little easier to understand is like unions,
Yeah.
where unions have the ability to strike and essentially shut down the means of the production for the more capitalistic class in America, which is the people who own the parts of the own the paperwork essentially, or the overall actual means of production. So like the machines, the building, the land. But in a socialistic society, the value is more leaned into the labor generates the value. And in a more capitalistic society, it's the person who has the stuff gets to say what the what the value is.
So one of the arguments I've heard against unions is, for instance, if you had a radio station that was run by a union, you had to have one person that set the disc on the player and another union person that had to put the record, had to put the thing on the recorder. And so and there was another individual just recently I was talking to or listening to talking about trying to shoot a simple video. And
Yeah.
because of the unions in Hollywood, um, it took 40 people, to do all of these particular jobs, and they all had to get top pay, and they all, couldn't be ignored. And and so the cost of producing this video was extremely high. Whereas the argument he was making is in a more capitalist setup, he could do it with like less than a quarter of that group, and he could probably do it with higher quality individuals because they would have to compete for those positions in the market. So, what would be, I don't know, what would be the argument? What would be the socialist argument to argue against that narrative?
Um. So the entire premise of so again, every structure can be inefficient. So in that scenario, the unions have some level of inefficiency. that inefficiency is for the person who, like the more capitalistic person in this environment. So the inefficiency is the fact that they wanted something their way, but the labor or the people who have control of the labor wanted to make sure that they were getting the value that they deserved and that they were doing the certain jobs that they were hired for. Uh, as somebody who worked in entertainment with IATSE a lot, um, I have seen some of that inefficiency. I have seen the fact that sometimes it's just the people who have been there the longest have the highest seniority. But again, every system can be defined differently. Some unions are very efficient, and then sometimes there are multiple types of unions that are all button heads together. And there's also sometimes there's just people that don't like that you signed a contract with the unions that say, hey, these people only do this job. And if you want other people to do other jobs, you have to hire them. Or you have to pay these people for those other jobs as well. And they can't be competing against other union brothers that have that type of environment. So it's a complicated balance in a capitalistic society to have unions. However, the unions are the only real group of people that protect labor. And what I mean by that is the unions are the reason we have a 40-hour work week instead of just a whatever work week.
Yep.
And they're also one of the main reasons why we have any kind of safety protections, because the owners, like the big capitalistic overlords way back in the day, didn't give a flying about you. It
Yep.
was literally just they're trying to make whatever profit they have. They built whole cities, and just so you would come work. I mean, they would buy out all the land in an area around any kind of real resource,
Yep.
and then if you wanted to live, you had to work for them. And if you
Yep.
have to work for them, then you don't have any say over your safety, your health, your wages. And if there's groups of enforcers that are hired by the capitalist person to say not let you leave, then all of a sudden think you're technically in capitalism, but there's no protections because there's no unity of people trying to help protect you. So can any system be taken too far to make it inefficient? Yes. But I don't think either of these systems work terribly well. Well, I think so. The more union system would work better by itself than just a capitalistic system. But again, they're not mutually exclusive. But
Yeah.
I tend to believe that, like the general trope of if if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
Yeah.
Is an important philosophy to have. However, uh, you have to have more unified culture within these groups to be able to make it function very well. And a lot of times I've seen in unions, they tend to make simple rules to try to deal with complex problems, but that's also every social structure tends to do that.
Yep.
And if that gets too far out underneath them, then it doesn't seem to work quite as well. But there's also different types of structures for unions than the one that you proposed. With there is like a union for gaffers, a union for the lighting people, a union for the audio people, a union for the writers, a union for the actors. There's also industry style unions,
Yep.
uh, or things like co-ops, where everybody in this one company has a stake and a say in it, and it's more democratically run in that scenario.
Yep.
But
I think if you had, I think if you had a structure where unions had to stay small and they had to have competition, where if there was inefficiencies, they simply won't be able to compete on the market, rather than being as large over an entire industry, having a monopoly over an entire industry in an area. If they had to compete, then they'd have to work to become more efficient.
uh, I could say the same about any capitalist system or like
For
group
sure.
of people too. Yeah, it's like, I mean, as soon as you start getting a monopoly of power, that tends to cause a problem.
Yep.
But the kicker with the monopoly in a union is that's a whole bunch of people, not one person. So it's a more democratic thing, which again is going to lead into some unnecessary bureaucracy. But also, it leans into a one person doesn't get to take advantage of everybody who's either doesn't have enough leverage or isn't intelligent enough to know what's happening to them, or has been lied, like been sold a bill of goods that wasn't real and they just haven't figured it out yet. So there's bureaucracy that comes with protection of your personal rights, and yeah, say there's it's essentially, does one person get it or does the group who contributed to it get it? There needs to be, like, it seems like there's a balance there where individuals having the ability to work with labor groups seems to have a pretty strong functioning ability. However, if certain unions gain too much uh, leverage in things, they can grind things to a halt. But on that same note, if they're grinding stuff to a halt, it's also because the person who's in charge of it isn't working with the unions. So there's a balance. Yeah,
Okay.
I don't think there's an inherent one way or the other.
So let's look at some examples of socialism. First, we've got China. What do you think of China's version of socialism? Or are
Uh,
they socialists?
by name, yes. Well, I mean, technically by name they're communist. Uh, but I don't. I really, to be fair, I don't think any of the countries that exist in the world today are either communist or socialist or capitalist. They're all some version of hybrid. And China is definitely autocratic.
Mhm.
They have a more centrally planned structure, and they tend to have a very class-based society, uh, which is not the definition of communism, which is a
Yeah.
stateless, classless society.
Yep.
So it definitely seems as if it was a dynastic society that tended to lean into a more centrally planned structure of, like, if you want to call them elites, or like the people who owned the most came in, or the people who had the most guns came in. I don't know the full history of how the Chinese government got to where it is right now. But it definitely used to be more dynastic, and it was essentially the equivalent of kings and feudalism. And
Yep.
then they came into a more hierarchical, more centrally oriented government system, which is not very democratic. It tends to be just the people in charge get to pick who's the next in charge, which there's arguments for and against that. I don't like it for the sense of there's no real freedom of choice over who's ruling over you. But there's also some really strong efficiencies in that, where they can make 100-year plans
Yes.
where we can barely get past four.
Yep.
And so we have some real benefits there, and they have some real benefits. And one of the things they try to do is they try to keep everybody working and busy all the time, and that tends to lead to some weird stuff like giant empty cities. They've also tried to control birth rates, which has led to not giant, but no, towns that are 90+% men,
Yep.
and they essentially just farm and stay out of people's way.
All right. So another example I'd like to look at is Sweden. I actually really enjoyed researching Sweden, and I didn't get too deep into it, but they have a lot in common with us. There's a couple elements of their structure, governmental structure, I like. I can't remember what it was called, but there's something about um, the citizens being able to put uh, proposals together for their government. And I really liked that idea. That's something that I've wanted to uh, kind of see for the United States is a more direct way for its citizens to propose things rather than needing to rely directly on their representatives. So I liked that. Sweden is a country that uses a version of socialism that seems to be working rather well. So what about their flavor of socialism is making it function as well as it does?
They would argue that they're not socialist.
Interesting.
At least from what I've seen online, they tend to say that they're essentially a capitalist or a market-driven company or country that has strong social safety nets.
Gotcha. Because I've heard many on the left, or I've heard the narrative that people on the left look to Sweden as being an example of socialism working. So that's interesting. So, where do you draw the line, or where do people in general draw the line between socialism and like public safety net systems?
Depends on how ideologically captured you are. Uh, uh, so again, socialism by definition is the workers having the control of the means of production.
Gotcha.
So if you're taking that into account, anything that is more union oriented or more government oriented and less like wild discrepancies in wealth between the haves and the haves nots, all of that could be considered socialistic ideals. I don't know where to draw the line because if you're hyper capitalistic, the line is very, very, very close to your toes. It's like if I can't kick it myself, it's socialism. And if you're in a more socialistic mindset, it's kind of well, that's a you're probably going to be less inclined to value individual ownership and individual massive gains from ownership.
Okay.
And like so one of the lines that I usually argue with people is the average CEO pay, which CEOs of course are not specifically the capital class, like the people who actually own the shares of everything. But if the owner is the CEO, they on average make like once you get over like a $1 billion cap or like 100 million cap, I think is what it is. They tend to make about up to anywhere between 350 to 6,000 times the wages as the person who is paid the least. And a more socialist minded person would argue if you took that one person that is at the top and owns it, even if they owned everything and like everything about it, they would not be able to generate 3,500 times more value with that same stuff than the person who is like the guys, you know, pulling the lever and bending the sheet metal
Yeah.
because you need the actual labor to be able to accomplish the stuff. And so it's the defining line is how, or I guess the where you would draw that line for yourself if you were trying to think about it is at what point do you think you are more capable of generating all of this wealth, or how much do you think you contribute to the generation of all the wealth versus how much do you consider the labor or the people who make the thing or distribute the thing are generating in the wealth.
Okay. So I tend to lean more capitalist myself. And so my question would be, um, it seems to be that capitalism encourages a lot of creation. So you have someone with an idea or someone driven to make a business because they know that with their idea or with their management, whatever the case might be, that they can create something that is unique and brings value to the market. And then uh, because they take that risk and because they put all of that work into creating and managing this thing, they create jobs, which then those jobs create opportunities for other people, to make a living. And you're always going to have people who are more inclined to create and take risks, and you're going to have people who are going to be more comfortable just wanting to pay the bills so that they can focus on other things, whether it be family, personal entertainment, whatever the case might be. And so there's nothing necessarily inherently wrong with having people who take those risks and put all that effort in to create things, uh, gaining gaining more money than someone who just really just wants to get by day to day. And the other side of that is I would agree that the wealth gap is definitely an issue. Not necessarily between the average owner or CEO, but definitely in some of these larger companies that we have allowed to get way too big. Um, so yeah, I don't know what's your reaction to, does that make sense? Like with the capitalist
Oh,
argument?
yeah, no, I understand the capitalist argument. It makes enough sense. However, one of my like devil's advocate questions is what is the risk they're taking? And when I say that, I mean I'm just going to give you the answer. I don't remember what TV show or what person said this, so it's a totally stolen idea. And if I remember, I'll bring it up later. But as a general rule, the only thing that the capitalistic class is risking is a chance to become part of the labor force again. So if you lose everything as a capitalist and like or the
Bankruptcy.
person who made the idea, you just become a worker again.
Yeah.
So what risk are you really taking? So that the argument of they take all the risk. No, they put in a specific type of work that can have a certain type of failure,
Hmm.
but you're still just back to being working class if you fail.
Yeah.
And so, uh, in a more uh, in a more socialistic environment, you usually would work with groups to make those things happen. But I mean, again, in the end, and if you're in a competing union or a competing like group that has like control of the means of production, the risk is you have to go back to working for somebody else. It's not like yeah, so you only lose the profit that you make by having had tried the idea. So it's like I don't like that argument doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I mean, I like the narrative, but the argument itself doesn't make much sense to me.
Okay.
If that
So,
makes
and
sense.
yeah, yep. So another side of it is human beings inherently like to own things. We like, it makes us feel secure, it makes us feel powerful, and just having, generally speaking, having ownership over something gives us a sense of security, power, contentment. Psychologically, we like to own things. And so someone who puts their heart and soul into creating a business or creating a product, for them to then be required to relinquish that, um, does seem to challenge that human nature of wanting to own something, that you've worked so hard to
Yeah.
create.
But I mean, in capitalism, I mean, again, I like the idea of being able to own something for yourself. I don't think that under many socialist structures that people are afraid of, or like that they claim. I mean, the ones that they're afraid of are the autocratic socialistic things where you don't actually have any say over anything.
Hmm.
But people tend to put all of socialism under that one blanket. Uh, or they try to use it as a way to say that people are going to become weak and frail and like leech off the state, yada yada yada. Or like, yeah, I'll say, but what's a good way to the the consumers have as much say as the person owning and running the company because they can choose to not purchase something even if that person has a dream and wants to own it. So, like, there's only so much value that your idea by yourself can generate without other people being involved.
So the argument could be made that the drive for winning the lottery, so it were, as it were, to succeed in creating a business and becoming very wealthy is part of the drive that drives so much creation. And in a capitalist system that is running properly, um, the market for ideas and the market for labor, when again when it's managed correctly, should encourage healthy wages, should encourage um, healthy sharing of those profits. Under our current version of capitalism, that's not happening. Um, but yeah, all right. Any final thoughts on socialism, capitalism, and communism?
Just my one extra joke for the continuation of, uh, capitalism is a perfect system on paper. The only thing that sets it up is selfish people, and communism is a perfect uh, structure on paper, and the only thing that sets it up is selfish people.
Yep.
Um, but socialism is a horrible system on paper, but seems to be what actually works best for people.
Interesting. Okay, that's
Well, I
quite the
mean,
claim.
because I mean, the more capitalistic societies have to adopt social structures, or everything falls apart, and the more communistic people have to lean into more socialistic stuff, which is like less central governance and more people governance, and that's how we make it work. And that's because we are a whole bunch of monkeys in suits that like to be tribal. So unions are a more appropriate size structure than one person rules everybody, because capitalism is essentially grown into like uh, neo feudalism, with like the few people at the top being able to control 8 hours of everybody's day that works underneath them, and they have all of the say over these little kingdoms. And then people just have the honor to work in their little kingdoms. Uh, I mean, this is the more communistic, socialistic viewpoint of it, but so that tends to lead people to want more socialistic control over their lives and have more protections from these people that are just telling them what they can and can't do for 8 hours a day. And then in a more communistic society, they don't want to be centrally run by one government, and they want to be able to do their own thing more. So they end up leaning into a more socialistic style system because they want more say over at least their groups, their families, and their local entities.
Yeah.
So the more middle ground is the more socialistic ground, which is tends to be where most people end up leaning toward, whether they say it or not.
So maybe the answer is some balance in between.
Oh yeah, it's a hybrid system. Like there's got to
Yeah.
be some. So again, not. I know I already said the trope, but it's if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. That they don't have to exist only by themselves.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on to anarchy. So I'm going to take the lead on this one. I love anarchy. I love anarchists. The whole concept is near and dear to my heart. So for those who don't know, anarchy is the absence of government. That doesn't necessarily mean the absence of governance. It means the absence of a centralized government. And so the theory behind anarchy, there's several different flavors, but one of the theories behind anarchy is just cooperative groups and having markets that manage themselves. And so if you have security concerns, you have a group of people who provide that service and you pay them for it. It's very capitalist. Um, and so I don't think it works because I think any structure like that where it's not managed by some kind of central authority, you're going to have people who are going to look to grab that power and that authority because it's just human nature. You're going to have that percentage of people that are just driven to make the world work the way they want it to work. And so it doesn't matter, how you structure an anarchist system. I don't see it working, but I love hearing arguments of anarchists because all of the principles I love. So all the anarchists out there, feel free to tell me in the comments why I'm wrong and give me a great explanation as to how it could actually function and, over the long term. Um, but yeah, what are your thoughts on anarchy?
It's Uh, it's communism with more steps.
Interesting. Okay. I've never heard that
Uh,
comparison.
uh, it's a classless, stateless society where everybody just kind of tries to get along. It's, in theory, almost the exact same thing.
Interesting.
Uh,
Yeah.
Then
Because
neither of them work for the same reason. It's because
yeah.
people are super selfish.
Yep.
But so like this is just something that popped into my head. The go to argument against ANCAPs or like anarcho capitalists uh, is the fire truck dilemma. I'm sure you've heard of this, or if you
No,
haven't, you're
tell me.
about to.
Yeah.
Supposedly, in the earlier periods of, I don't know if it was New York or some one city out there, and again, I don't even know if this story was true, but there is at least a legend, we'll say, that back before firemen were actually part of the government and funded by a communal source or a communal budget, they would have private fire people,
Hmm.
and there was multiple instances where you had to pay to have your fire put out.
Ooh.
And so they would show up and then negotiate with you to put out your fire. And so if they were showing up and they were the only one there, they could have a monopoly and just be like, well, we want, if you can't pay us enough, we want everything out of your house that that we saved,
That
but
we
you can
saved.
keep the
Yeah.
house.
Yep.
Uh, but otherwise, we'll let your dog burn. You know,
Yep.
and again, I'm just throwing random examples out there. But there's
Yeah.
also the other version, which is there's actually competition, and both of them are hungry because there haven't been many fires, and
Gotcha.
all of them have axes,
That's
and one of the group wants to put out the fire, so they kill
yep.
each other in the streets to be able to put out the fire.
Yep. We'll get into this a little bit later, but that's actually one of the driving forces behind the rights argument of the deep state. All of these bureaucracies that need a reason to function and actually want to do good things, just look for more reasons to exist and then create more bureaucracy in order to self-sustain, to have a purpose, because everyone needs a purpose.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll get to that one in a little bit. Let's move on to a presidential system. It's not really a form of government by itself, at least that I've ever seen, but it's integrated into a lot of different governments. And I bring it up here because you can have a president like Putin who is elected by the people, which is I quote that because it's questionable as to what degree of uh, security and integrity there are in those elections.
If you kill all your opponents, there's no one else to vote for.
Yeah, yeah. Or if you put your opponent like in, if you're putting your opponent in, and then just say, yeah, here, run against me, and we'll make you lose regardless, just for the
Or
facade.
what he did, which was he ran out his like what 12 years that he was allowed to be president,
Yep.
and then
Put in a puppet.
he had his prime minister, like the person that was right his number two,
Yep.
run against him or run in the next election cycle.
Yep.
I don't remember what they did to the other person, but essentially that person won with a 90% vote, and then they just redid the laws so you could have more terms.
Yep.
And then Putin just came back in the next term, but he was like the prime minister. He became the second in command for the period of time in which he wasn't president.
Yep.
So it's like, I'll say,
Yep. Well, and you could have a presidential system where it's actually legit and you vote someone in and they're the authority, and that's still kind of tyrannical and not necessarily a healthy balance of power.
oh yeah,
So anyway, and let's go to a parliamentary system. So this is kind of similar to what the United States has in a Congress, but um, it's more centralized. My impression has been that a parliamentary has more centralized authority within that rather than multiple branches of government like the United States has. So it's generally very compatible with democracy, and usually is central. It's only works with democracy, where you have parliaments that are representative of the people and hold all executive and legislative authority combined. So, any interesting insights on parliamentary systems?
It's essentially like democracy. I mean, at that case, in a lot of that scenario, it's democracy of the landowners in a lot in the cases that I can think of. So like the people who owned the most stuff or the most land, like the dukes and duchesses of the old kingdom, like their family lines seem to be a lot of the parliamentary people,
Yeah.
or at least that was the case. I think it's a lot more democratic now than when they first kind of transitioned.
Yeah,
Um,
the examples that
yeah.
I've seen, the executive is actually decided, the executive leader is actually decided by parliament. So the parliament
Okay.
will take one of their members and they'll say, this is going to be our chancellor or our leader,
Oh yeah.
whatever the title is. So even though the executive is theoretically separate from the parliament, it's really controlled by the parliament. And at any point, the parliament can come in and say, well, we've lost confidence. And so the executive is very much controlled by the parliament, which has its ups and downs.
Yeah.
And then as far as the judicial, I'm not sure how that, I think judges are also appointed by, I could be wrong there, and it could be different with different versions of the system, but I think Parliament puts judges in as well. So it's very centralized with the Parliament. However, it's not as bad because it's they're elected by the groups that they represent. So imperfect, but you know, manageable seemingly because there's many countries that seem to function relatively well under that system.
That seems to be a relatively decent democratic structure, but it doesn't seem to have quite as many check and balances.
Agreed. All right, well, let's move on. Technocracy. Now, this is an interesting one. It is the idea of institutions or a expert class, as it were. That's my interpretation, where you have a group of people who are experts in their field managing a government. Usually, you have this is integrated with other elements of government. You can have a presidential system, you can have a republic, a democracy, all sorts of things. But when the authority and decision making primarily, or at least to a great degree, leans towards an expert class of people, that's when it becomes a technocracy. Does that fit what you found?
I believe so. I mean, yeah, I don't. Yeah, it's essentially instead of like the ruling class of elites being the people who own the most, it's the ruling class of elites are the people who are the smartest in their fields.
Mhm.
Uh, so it's a different way of defining where the value is in a more oligarchic or like group oriented leadership role.
Yeah. And this kind of gets into Republicans' narrative about deep state. Um, this is a technocracy is kind of what would be the end result of a deep state, as it were. So my understanding about the narrative from the right about the deep state is you've got all of these people that have put in to manage different aspects of the government who have become experts in their field, and actually many of them are very valuable for their knowledge and expertise and how they manage things. But whenever you create whenever you create a group like this, it feeds itself with needing more purpose, more people, more funds. In fact, an example I can give in my time in the military was if we didn't spend our budget to the utmost every year, that would mean that our budget would get cut next year. So when you have an organization that is wanting to sustain itself, it's going to create reasons to need to exist, kind of like the firefighters, starting their own fire that you gave an example of earlier. But in this case, in most cases, a more genuine desire to serve the country, I'm sure. well-intentioned as well as those who are not well-intentioned. And this also ties into the military-industrial complex. So whenever you've got power and authority, whether it be by financial means or by just a bureaucracy managing things, that's where this whole deep state narrative comes from the right.
Hmm. I mean, I'm intrigued by that. I'm not sure if I followed the logic on that. So, like, I feel like by definition, a technocracy would be the most meritocratic system that we could run across. Uh, because it's literally like, oh, hey, if there's uh, say, an AI czar, for lack of a better term, um, then you'd put the people who are the best at AI, or whoever like, if there's like a top five, I'm assuming it would be really hard to tell who was the best. So I'm assuming whatever quote unquote, like, either autocratic or democratic political structure would then put them in charge of the country's AI.
Yeah.
Uh, or say the best general would be put in charge of the war, like the war stuff, and like the best like militaristic builder, like the
Mm-hmm.
people who make weapons would be put in charge of that thing. But I don't know how to I don't know how to balance what you said about that making the deep state, or how to balance that being what would cause you to not, uh, or like if you didn't spend your money, then your money was gone in that
So
example. So I just may not have followed it correctly.
yeah, that's fine. So, and I might not be doing a very good job of explaining it. So, the idea behind having experts in the government is actually not a bad thing inherently. It's the same question of balance. And so, when you've got a technocracy or a expert class that has grown within the government beyond what is a healthy balance, and that's the argument that the right is making when they're talking about the deep state, is this blob, this entity that is growing beyond what is healthy. um, then you need to go through and need to pare that down again in order to have that healthy balance. And part of that is the spending, and that's where it comes into play with departments needing to spend their budget. So you get all of these departments within the government, and I'm pretty sure they all operate under that same concept. If you don't use your funds, you don't get those funds next time around. And I could be wrong. That's been my impression. Um,
So so Congress defines where the funds go.
yes.
If Congress doesn't change your funding level doesn't change. So if you don't use that, like if you use 70% of what your budget is, then Congress is going to, like, through the inspectors general's audits and everything of these entities, they're going to assume that you don't need that amount to function in the same. So there is an incentive to use your entire budget, but that is defined by Congress, not by your usage, if that makes sense.
Yeah. But then
So
you would
yeah,
have
and each year they pass
departments.
a new budget. Yeah.
Yeah. And then within that larger department that is receiving funding, you have sub departments that all have their budget that they're all trying to utilize. And so it might be more of a myopic issue as far as spending all the money versus on the larger scale. Um,
Yeah, everybody wants a bigger budget, so they always are going to try to push.
yep.
Uh, they're. I mean, assuming that they believe in what they're doing,
Yes. Yep.
but that's why we need, like, inspectors generals that are outside of. I mean, if we're talking specifically the United States, who are there to audit these groups,
Yep.
which we happened to fire 17 of them because people who were being investigated didn't like it.
Yep. Well,
That's a whole
theoretically,
extra.
yeah.
That's a whole
We'll
extra conversation.
yep. We'll have to get into that at some point. But so yeah, that just to kind of give a frame of reference as to the right's explanation or argument for the deep state. It is that bureaucracy, that technocracy kind of taking shape. Um, and again, not necessarily evil intentions by those who are working those departments. Um, Sometimes probably malicious, but not always. So that's the deep state. So let's move on to a Republican form of government. So I had a little bit harder time finding a lot of information on republics. But the general concept is it's a representative, a regional representative system. So it's democratic in that there's voting for your representatives, but instead of being pure democracy where the people are directly voting on issues, you have representatives. Some of the downsides with republics, or some of the challenges with a republic, can be um, it can be a facade. I think many republics, many governments that claim to be a republic, do so just as a facade, and it's very anti-democratic. Um, Another challenge that the United States faces particularly is voter apathy. If you don't have a lot of people engaged in a republic, it can become very unbalanced as
Or
far
a
as
democracy. Yeah.
as far as properly representing the people. And one of the challenges that comes with a republic is having a proper balance when it comes to population centers and more rural groups. And that's one of the reasons why we have the structure we do within the United States, to try to create some balance between those social groups. But yeah, any thoughts on what a republic is and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing?
I tend to believe that the more power to the more people that want to say in it, the better. So I tend to like a more republic style. In common vernacular, a lot of people conflate uh, republic and democrat, or like democracy. So not
Yep.
Republican and Democrat, but
Yeah.
uh, like a republic is essentially for the people. So it tends to be a representative style of democracy, and
Yep.
a quote unquote democracy is more of a individual person, like one voice, one vote, or one person, one vote
Yep.
type of rule. They have very similar uh, issues, um, but yeah, I'll say they're not necessarily mutually exclusive,
Hmm.
but they're so interchangeable at this point because you barely have, like, you can't really have a republic without democracy, but you can have democracy without a republic,
Yep.
because you can have direct democracy, but that comes with its own whole extra slew of problems too.
Yep. Yep.
So yeah.
One of the biggest problems, and you were probably referring to this when you were saying that both republics and democracies have this issue, is corruption of the elected leaders. Um, and that, I mean, just the general concept of elected leaders not properly representing what their um, what their constituents actually want, and that's been a problem for people on the right and the left.
Yeah. Or the people not understanding what's going on,
Yep.
uh, because sometimes the people just don't like what is best for them. Because I mean, it's not
So when you s-
everybody. Not
what
everybody knows. Like, just make, like, happiness isn't necessarily the best thing in every situation, or like being polite is not always the best thing. But everybody wants a happy, polite person around them. They don't like the person who's going to always tell them that, your soup's poisoned, or that, this type of thing that you're doing has much more negative effects than you believe it does. So there's sometimes it's just people don't know, and the fact that they are ignorant to stuff makes them hate the people that are in charge because it's above their head. So it's kind of
Okay.
a,
So
yeah,
you're
say,
saying you're saying in some cases that the leader who's been elected has a perspective that is more accurate to the needs of his constituents, and so the laws that he's advocating for it might be what the people would want if they understood the situation more clearly.
Yeah, yeah. Or if they cared about their neighbor more,
Okay.
or yeah, or if like it's also like uh, an elected leader may be and this is like a very extreme case, but like might be like a hyper capitalist that says if you don't like that they're poisoning your water supply, move.
Hmm.
There's also ones that might just be like, hey, we're going to shut down the part of the government that tells you if your water supply is being poisoned.
Yeah.
And so people might like that because they're not getting poisoned anymore.
At least perceptively. Yep. Yep.
Yeah. And so like
Yep.
you don't always know everything. And that's part of like the whole representative democracy is not everyone has either the time or the aptitude to know enough to be educated enough to make direct decisions on everything.
Yep. Which makes a good argument to have a republic, because then you try to decide who do we think has the right perspectives and insights and knowledge to be the one to look out for our best interests, and then we put that person in charge. So
Yeah.
it's a balance. Yeah, it's a good balance.
But it's also just as much in the short term who makes me feel the best.
Yeah, which is a
And
problem.
then yeah, and as chemicals and drugs and weapons become more powerful, uh, that becomes more and more dangerous if the person that makes you feel good knows that all they need to do is make you feel good to vote for them.
Yep.
And because they don't necessarily have to have your best wishes in heart if it benefits them and theirs.
Yep.
They just have to make you feel like it to vote for them. So like again, there's issues like
On all sides.
that's kind of the whole idea of like one of the arguments against the right's version of the deep state is you don't want someone that just makes you feel good and sells you a fucking snake oil coming in because and just up the whole system,
Yep.
because our system has kept us all at the top of the world, like in the US, like economically speaking, not necessarily education or anything else, uh, for the last 240 years.
Yep. Greater degrees of freedom
Well,
will always have
I guess
greater degrees of
technically only,
risk.
yeah, I guess only 100 years or so that we've really been at the top. But
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on to democracy. So there's pure democracy, which really isn't what the United States is, but pure democracy is where the people directly vote. And I've actually heard some interesting arguments. Shout out to Ren, the musical artist. He was making some arguments on X, um, about, because modern technology is in a place now where it could actually support a pure democracy more practically, that's something that, in his opinion, should be tried. I'd have to go back and look at his tweet to be sure on the specifics, but it was an interesting argument, and I disagree. I don't think a pure democracy is healthy for many reasons. For the reason that you pointed out, as far as people, don't understand all of the elements that come into play that they need to in order to be making all of the decisions.
yeah,
And the other side of that is I don't like the idea of majority rules, where you might have a minority of, say, 40% that doesn't want a specific law or doesn't want to be put in a certain position because of a law or a policy. And I've heard the analogy of pure democracy is two wolves and a lamb, deciding what's going to be for dinner. Well, it's going to be lamb. And so pure democracy has a lot of issues, but I'm sure someone will try to figure out some way of making it work. But a representative democracy is kind of an interchangeable term with a republic. At least that's what I've gathered. Representative democracy is where you vote in people to
it's a bunch
represent
of
your
sheep
needs.
voting for the wolves.
Exactly.
Which wolves are going to be at the top.
Yep, yep. That's a good way of putting it. But and because you're always going to have people who are ambitious who are going to be in leadership, and that comes with its challenges.
Yeah, I think the noble, unwanting philosopher is the best leader. The people who don't want to lead, that spend all of their time trying to figure out what is good and bad, are probably the best leaders, but they're also never going to be the ones that want to lead.
Yep, they don't have that drive.
Well,
Yep, for
yeah, say
power.
they want to know how everything works, and they want to make sure that they want to understand the world as best as possible, and they spend all their time doing that instead of trying to gain power.
Yep.
But they would be the best leaders if we could find them, pinpoint them, and force them into power at a certain age. That'd be the way to go.
Yep.
I mean,
Uh,
I don't like forcing anyone to do it, but they, yeah, I'll say, I think that's probably true.
yep. And the last one we want to look at is federalism. So federalism is the United States. We've got individual states that have authority under a federal government. Um, I don't know. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Any thoughts on federalism and if it's a good thing or a bad thing?
Mostly good. It's like communal democracy.
Hmm.
Um, so it's like democracy on a smaller scale that then they hierarchically tier up to the next level of democracy on a different scale.
Yeah.
So it's like local government votes for these people, but then, well, I guess in our case, the people vote for the very local government, and then they also vote for the kind of bigger government, and then those people and the same people also vote for the head of the biggest government, but then all of the rules, laws, and others are made by the people that they elect.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a, yeah, I'll say it's an interesting system that we have. That's like, I mean, it's definitely federalist, uh, but yeah, it gives for a potential diversity of cultural ideas to be explored in different areas.
Yeah.
Uh, it can also cause problems with cultural ideals being explored in different areas.
Yes, for sure.
Uh, and so, like, I mean, a prime example would be um, the beginning of the Civil War,
Yes.
where the argument was that I mean, some people argued that it was a states' rights argument.
Yep.
But if you look at the top of every declaration of war, it was the states' right to do slavery,
Yep.
which means do as a federation and a federal government, do we want every person in the government to be equal in the eyes of the federal government? And
Yep.
do they also need to be equal in the state government? So
Yep.
it kind of depends on how much flexibility and how much of a floor you're willing to tolerate in every state, or like what's the minimum level of acceptance that the federation is willing to tolerate in every state, and trying to suss that out.
Yep.
So I think it's, I mean, every complicated system is going to have its hiccups, but I think it is one of the better systems that we have run across, especially for something the size of the
Yes.
United States.
Yep, agreed. So I am actually very passionate about federalism. So I'm going to pitch this thought to you and get your reaction. So I believe that we were set up as a federalist structure intentionally so that you could have different groups, as you said, experimenting with laws and social structures to do things kind of independently and experiment. And that way you could see what systems were being successful and they could compete with other ideas and systems. And it could really optimize people's ability to seek their freedom in a collective sense, because communities could aspire to the type of society and type of structure that they wanted to be a part of and voluntarily be a part of that. And I think that even though there's a good argument, a very good argument for the Civil War, and slavery did absolutely need to end one way or another, that I am of the belief that we pushed too far in the other direction and we centralized way too much of our authority in the federal government because of that. and that we should be pushing back towards a more strong federalist structure where a greater degree any law or authority that can be delegated to the states should be delegated to the states. And there's all sorts of arguments as to where those lines should be drawn for sure.
Yeah,
But I,
Can's doing a lot of lifting for you there.
yep, yeah, I would argue that I would love to see, as a more libertarian, leaning person, I would love to see, and this is a general concept, outside of the Department of Defense, I would like to see 80% of the power, authority, laws, funding of the federal government taken away from the federal government and given to the states. And I recognize that that means that I would probably be paying 4 times the state taxes I am right now, and just not as much for the federal taxes. And I'm totally fine with that, because I think that would create great competition between the states on how they operate things. And I think that would be beneficial for everyone, even though that does create lots of challenges. Right now, we're facing challenges because we have some states that have one law on whether someone can get an abortion or not, and another state has a different law. And so what happens when you have someone who goes to a different state to get an abortion? They come back and get arrested for murder. Or is told you can't cross state lines to go do that, and how do you enforce that? And you need a federal
Yeah,
government to manage some of those things. But I would like to see a lot more authority centralized in the states rather than the federal government.
yeah.
Decentralize as much as
And
possible.
there's some young person got a prescription for abortion stuff from New York,
Yep.
and now the attorney general of the state that has much stronger abortion laws is trying to sue that doctor
Mm,
in New York. So they're trying to sue across state lines
yeah.
for somebody who did something legal in their state.
Yep.
And
Got to figure that
eh,
one out.
yeah, well, no, you don't got to figure on that one out. That's a blatant violation of federalistic principles. If you care about that, because
Yeah.
you should only really have to worry about the uh, laws in your land. However, that's one of the big problems of the federalist concept, which is if you don't have a generalized set of laws across all of them, then uh, the people that get the low tax in one, or like that will have really low income tax, but can have a really high standard of living if they live in a certain area.
Yep.
They could just live right near the border, go work in one state, and then
Yep.
just come and not pay any income tax into that state because of the way that it's all panned out, and then come live in the area where everybody is paying like 40% income tax to have all the good shit.
Yep. There are
And so,
problems.
yeah, say so that yeah, it's I like the idea of federalism, but the whole federalist part, like the federal government, is vital for a state to work, or a federal structure to work.
Yep.
Uh, but I feel like what you're kind of defining is more like a confederation,
Yeah.
which is
Yep.
more like the original 13, where they were essentially just the EU,
Yeah. I would
which
like
is
to lean
also a
more.
system that most people don't like to
Yeah.
hear. But I mean, the EU is much closer to what the founding fathers were originally lining up, and
Yep.
that still has wildly problematic issues, which is the same issue that we just talked about, which is the fiscal and financial uh, differences in each one are still tied to the overall international value of
Yep.
the euro. And so, say Germany, who when they started with the EU had a significant higher GDP and higher technology levels than most of the other countries, and then say Italy had much higher social welfare programs and had a higher like they really liked their quality of life. But then when you put them in the same economic and fiscal structure as somebody who does not give a and is going to work to the bone,
Yep.
then they don't play the same game. But before, they were kind of okay.
Yep.
Like they could kind of handle their own, except Germany could have just maybe steamrolled the entire European continent.
Yeah.
uh, militaristically. Not
Yep.
saying that that ever happened, but
Yeah. So
uh,
I would
and
agree. It
so
comes. Yeah.
yeah. Oh, I was just
It
saying,
comes
like,
with
so
its issues.
there's wildly strong issues there if you don't have a unifying factor for all of them, and that
Yep.
unifying factor really has to balance a lot of stuff. Like, for example, like 13 of the 14 poorest states in the country are also the ones that pay the least amount of taxes into the federal government, but are also the ones that get some of the most federal funding back. Like,
Yep.
for example, like a bunch of red states, and then I think it's like New Mexico are like the bottom 14. I don't know for sure, but I think it's like the bottom 10 are all red.
Yeah.
And so they're all supplemented by the higher taxed blue states
Yep.
that seem to be producing better.
Yep.
Uh,
And I don't like the redistribution of funds between between the federal government and the states. I think it just creates issues. I mean, you
yeah, I
have
mean
to some degree, but yeah.
that's why I said you have to negotiate where that bottom floor is and
Yep.
what universal principle, well, federalistic, like
Unite.
across the
Yeah.
federation principles are going to unite.
Yep.
Uh, and I think, yeah, we haven't been able to find a really solid balance for that yet.
Yep. So I've got an
As
unfair
noted.
question. Go
Oh
ahead.
yeah, absolutely. I,
I've
I
got an
love
unfair
unfair
question
questions.
for unfair question for you. So we started this video with, are we a republic or are we a democracy? So at our core, are we more a republic or more a democracy?
Republic.
Yeah, I would agree.
I mean,
Yep.
barely. I mean,
Yeah.
but to be completely honest, it's a
So intertwined.
combination of both.
For
Uh,
sure.
but we're not a direct democracy, so we're not like the full theoretical democracy.
Yep.
But we are also not a full federation, or like we're not a full federalist country.
Yep.
Uh, or, or republic. Sorry, I got my
The
terms mixed
republic.
up.
Yeah.
Republic,
Yep.
and so we're not both, but we are a clearly defined uh, representative democracy that kind of blends some aspects of a direct democracy with some aspects of a full republic.
Yep. Which I like. I think it's generally speaking, the intention is a good balance.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's a relatively well thought out system uh, that has a whole lot of problems.
Yep.
But I mean, the more
Any
people that
system is.
yeah, the more people, especially the more diverse ranges of thoughts of people that you put into a large group, the more of a challenge you are going to have in making all of them happy.
So why do you think our founders set up a hybrid system rather than a pure republic or um any other form of government? Why do you think they picked this hybrid of these two, the democracy and the republic?
People are too dumb for democracy, especially at the time. Like a lot less people were read. It was a lot more people. I mean, dumb is a more aggressive and mean way to say it,
Yeah.
but the general population, uh, not too many of them were readers. Not too many of them knew what was going on outside of the specific things they were doing in their family. So you needed people that were able to spend their time and life specializing in not doing day-to-day mundane tasks to make sure that overall management of structures could happen.
Yeah.
Uh, and but you also couldn't have everybody spending all of their time learning everything, or nothing else would get done.
Yeah.
And so, like, having the ability to hyper specialize with like workforces and things like that is a beneficial thing. However, it can lead to a gap in communication and understanding of what, say, like the other side of that coin is doing. So like the people who are working all day and then just see their taxes going up and the cost of eggs are going up, they aren't necessarily sure what mechanisms or why this is happening or what could be done to change it. They just know it sucks.
Yeah.
And for example, the people who are on Capitol Hill aren't always going to know uh, what it's like to not be able to afford those eggs, or not know that if you just could lighten up on this thing, then I'd be able to function. Or, like, so they have to balance the individual humanistic like aspects of life with the spreadsheet of management of large groups of things. And it's a balance that as soon as one side starts to um, take too much heat, uh, they start to demonize the other side or disregard the other side as being dumb or ignorant, or
Yeah.
there being like a turbo deep state that, like, hey, we don't know how everything runs, so it's a lot easier to just say all y'all are corrupt. Not saying that there isn't corruption
Yeah.
or waste. I do think there is a lot of corruption, waste, and unnecessary bureaucracy, but the arbitrary deep state comments for most people are woefully ill-informed as well. Just like, yeah, I mean, we can get into other terminology that makes me feel like people are woefully misinformed, uh, but I mean,
Well,
it's on both sides. It's like we
yeah.
don't like there's a reason that people are concerned about flyover state, like the term flyover state, and it's because a lot of people are just like, oh, they're farmers. Moving on.
Yeah.
It's not like the hub of innovation or the hub of like finance that New York or California are.
Yeah.
But without the flyover states, we all starve.
Yeah.
And so it's like it doesn't mean that they're both not hyper essential.
Yeah. So, how would you say our current system compares to the original system that the founders established? And how much of those changes are good and how much should we go back to? On the right, we have this narrative that Trump has sold us on make America great again. So, this idealizing of how things were. And I know you have opinions as to things not being necessarily so perfect or great or sunshiny as they were.
Yeah, well,
But yeah,
it's
what changes have?
when was it great? That's the
Yep,
kicker.
yep,
Because if you want to have that conversation, like, I mean, again, it's a slogan and a meme, and it makes people feel good about something, but it doesn't mean anything. There's always rose-colored glasses for the best parts of the past, but if you weren't living the worst parts of the past, uh, or have an understanding of certain things that were happening to groups that were not your in group, then it can be really problematic now that we are a more integrated society to talk about how far back was great,
yep,
or what aspects are we trying to make great again, and is that also indicating that as the number one superpower in the world that things aren't great. uh, so it's a way to make people motivated and feel better. I think it's a great marketing strategy, but I don't think it means anything. And I think a lot of people really thought it did, because most people, as far as I can tell, seem to think that when we're talking about Make America Great Again, it leans back into the 50s eras where it was like super, like very family centric, smaller communities. We were still on the gold standard. Certain things made a little bit more sense and were more simple.
yep,
Um, Everyone could afford a house if they worked 40 hours a week.
yep,
Like all of those things. And so, like, if you disregard like the racism, the redlining, and like everything that we did to minorities during that stretch of time, and the fact that women were still not treated so great, and like the suffrage movement was still kind of in play. If you disregard all that stuff and you just take like all of the social benefits that we've come across and you just move back to the 50s, everyone who's saying MAGA stuff would shit bricks at the tax code,
yeah,
because we had a 90% like corporate tax rate over a certain like $8 million.
yep,
And so we were making so much money in the middle class that we were starting to cause inflation in like this was just before the 50s, but that we were making so much inflation that we had to implement a maximum tax or a maximum pay rate. and then that's when people started integrating like health insurance and stuff into their uh, the payment structures because they could only pay certain people up to a certain amount. Because
Yeah.
if not, everything didn't have value.
Yep.
Uh, and so, because we
Yeah.
were already hyper overproducing, so it's
Yeah.
a what time and what specific things were great and for whom and why.
Yep.
So I don't. Yeah, again, I think that I understand the thought on it, but I've never been able to get a specific out of somebody that that felt like it was based in reality and not like this rose tinted nostalgia.
Yeah. Well, and I think even our in our lifetime, looking back at what middle class was, when we were younger, there's an argument to be made that housing was more affordable, uh, cost of living was more affordable, the middle class was a larger percentage of the population. So I think there's a general concept of a healthier balance that people associate with the Make America Great Again movement. I get that you're saying it's not very well defined, but I think it
Yeah,
not only is an effective narrative, an effective selling point, but I think it strikes to the hearts of what people are hoping that Trump and Republicans are going to bring to the table in the long term. So let's look at another question I've got for you. Will there always be a ruling class?
mm, no, yes, no. It depends on if we kill each other, like kill everybody or not. I mean, as long as we have people, there's going to be some kind of probably ruling class, unless we get some kind of ability to like homogenize our brains together. Uh, because people are we're monkeys in suits. We grew up in social hierarchy as monkeys. We still act like higher, like we just redefine what the social hierarchy is every so often. Like right now, it's money, um, money and certain amounts of power and the ability to defend yourself. But yeah, I'll say as long as there's an ability to get into a position to say no to somebody and there be a scarcity of resources to where uh, there is a reason to try to hoard things, we're going to have a ruling class.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, ruling class is also like a frame that if you change the way that you framed the question, I might have a slightly different answer.
Yep.
Because ruling is kind of a very libertarian frame on it. Um, it could also be a bureaucracy class or a governmental class, which is much less harsh of a terminology for it. Do I think that the we are always going to have a super corrupt leadership class? I think we could probably get away from that, but I
Agreed.
think we're always going to have some amount of people that are in charge of the system because without the system, the individuals are all just going to scatter like rats.
Yep.
Like they're just going to do whatever they need. Like without an overarching system or an overarching narrative or an overarching whatever kind of thing you want to call it. Like for us, it's the Constitution and the general principles that come with the Constitution is the American story essentially, and
Yep.
we all have to kind of buy into that story for the system to work. So I think we could potentially make better stories to help everybody unify, uh, or we could frame things differently. But uh, it would have to be once we figure out how to not leverage scarcity against each other for us to start having more positive leadership.
Yeah. I think that we're always going to have a ruling class, because it's human nature. We're going to have people who are more driven. But I think that
Okay.
if we have checks and balances, if that ruling class is both within the government, not outside of the government, like in big corporations, spending money to try to get their ends to their means. Um, if we can centralize that power within a government that is decentralized, and that is transparent and accountable to the people, which is the intention behind the system we have. We just need to better refine it. Um, I think that we can keep that ruling class in check and keep human prosperity at a maximum, but we're not there now for sure. The final question of the podcast is going to go unanswered, and that is, how is Trump's current actions compatible or incompatible with the American form of government? If you want to get the answer to that question, you'll have to tune into our next episode, part 2, where we're going to be looking at a lot of Trump's actions and having uncomfortable conversations about where the boundaries are in the Constitution as far as the executive branch, where that authority begins and ends. If you're interested in having that conversation, come back and see us again with the next episode, and we'll see where it takes us. Thanks for joining us.
Trying to trigger me in the last question.